I don't know. I found myself repeating that phrase over and over the first few times with my new counselor. He was asking tough questions about my childhood, difficult questions about my behavior, particularly in my first ministry role as a pastor. These were the kind of questions that make you want to squirm, but I was doing everything I could to sit still and to not answer his questions. Well, I don't know. As awkward as our third session was, it ended with my wise counselor leaning over to me and asking my permission. Do you mind if I make an observation about your last few sessions? You said I don't know a lot, but I think you really do know. You see, I don't know is often the answer given when someone is lacking the courage of convictions. Work this week on figuring out what you do know, and then we can really start to move forward. That was the nicest, kindest, most gracious kick in the pants that I've ever received. And you know what? He was right. I did have the answers to his questions. But I wasn't courageous enough to say the truth out loud, at least not at that point in my journey. In today's gospel text, Jesus is engaged in a series of questions with religious leaders. They're trying to get to the heart of his ministry by asking the question, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you that authority? This is a loaded question, a trick question, really. The chief priests and the elders already know the answer. They just saw Jesus clear the temple and declare, "My Father's house is to be a house of prayer." They have seen and heard more than enough from Jesus, and they know that he believes that his authority comes from God. But is Jesus brave enough to say it to their faces? If he says that my authority comes from God, they'll call him a heretic. Yeah, right, you talk for God. But if he references another source of authority, they've got every right to question his conclusions. He stands before them with no human authority, no college degree, no seminary training, no years of experience. They know he has no human authority because, well, they're the ones who hold the keys to authority in this part of the world. They've got him cornered. Either way he chooses, the religious leaders will use his words against him. They'll charge him with blasphemy, contempt for the very God that they proudly represent. Today, if you say that you speak for God, people will mock you. But in Jesus' day and age, if you say that you speak for God, they'll kill you. While religious leaders don't make official charges against Jesus at this point, just 5 chapters later, blasphemy is at the heart of their compelling case. So how does Jesus respond to their inquiry? Jesus adds fuel to the fire by pointing out their hypocrisy. They claim to speak for God. They're arbitrators of authority in a temple in Jerusalem. But who gave them that authority? Essentially, in this system, you can't be legit without their human blessing. Yet, all around them, the Spirit of God is doing something new. The most recent spiritual phenomenon before Jesus was the prophet John the Baptist. John was preaching to everyone who would listen, and while out in the desert, dressed like a camel, eating bugs and honey, he's not the model of a priest or an elder. Yet Jesus brings up John to prove his point about hypocrisy. Instead of answering their questions directly, he makes a wager with a question of his own. He says, "I'll answer you if you answer me first. By what authority did John the Baptist do ministry?" Now they're cornered too. They cannot say that they commissioned John because they publicly mocked him. And they cannot say that John's authority came from God because, well, that would legitimize both John and Jesus' own ministries. While tempted to mock both, the religious leaders know that the crowd loves these two charismatic characters. Their mockery would just lead to a revolt. So they give an answer that lacks the courage of their convictions. We don't know. We don't know by what authority John ministered. There's hollowness in their answer. They have seen the powerful evidence of changed lives emanating from both the ministries of John and Jesus. The evidence is clear and compelling, but admitting to what they see as true requires letting go of their false system of authority. As if to bring up John wasn't convincing enough, Jesus doubles down on them by sharing a parable about two sons. The story is directed squarely at the religious leaders. The second son represents them, the one who promises to do what God asks, but doesn't follow through. They have gone about their own way of functioning by their own authority. Their bluff is called. But the first son, while initially saying no to the offer, changes course and joins the movement. The first son is like the tax collectors and the sex workers who make up much of Jesus' entourage. They've lived lives in contradiction to God's ways, and yet they heard John and Jesus. When they heard the Spirit of God calling them to a new way of living, they changed their behavior and followed. Now they're on board with this new thing that God is doing, but the chief priests and the elders, they're not. They're so tightly wound up in tradition that they cannot see the new thing that God is doing through Jesus. Now, before we criticize these religious leaders too much, let's name our own hesitancy to embrace change, to practice new things. There's plenty of evidence in our world that old systems of government, of religion, of education are breaking down. And yet there's also evidence that God is up to something new. Fresh calls for justice, for change, for renewal, they are heard throughout the world. The old things are passing away and the new is emerging. But is there evidence in our own lives that we are willing to change our ways? Here are just a few examples. We've all seen the data about climate change. We know that the sea levels are rising and the polar ice caps are melting. The scientific evidence is mounting, and we've heard pleas from the experts to change our ways of doing things. But how many of us can point to at least one specific action we've undertaken in response? Have we abandoned our cars? Have we stopped using plastics? Have we taken any significant step towards change? It's hard to respond to an emerging reality, especially when it requires a change in lifestyle. But what is stopping us from this kind of positive action? Or take another example. Explore the data about racial inequity in our country. We know that the median worth of white families in America is 10 times that of black families. We know that in part that gap was created by unjust housing and loan policies. But many of us, have we given away some of our inheritance to correct the course, to balance the scales towards racial justice? Of course, money is the most measurable marker, but we could talk about employment or policing, education, imprisonment, a whole myriad of other issues where racial injustice is clearly present. The evidence is mounting, but can we point to a clear action on our part? The examples could go on and on as the call of hypocrisy rings in our ears, as Jesus' words reverberate in our hearts. We've all seen the statistics. We've heard the stories. Some of us have experienced the pain firsthand. Over the last 6 months, this pandemic has emerged, and we have seen stories about injustice play out in front of us. The blinders have been ripped off of our eyes. We no longer are blind to the facts. We have seen the evidence, but have we changed? The surprising point that Jesus makes here through this parable is, be like the tax collectors and the sex workers. They saw the error of their ways and they changed their behavior. Don't be like the chief priests and the elders who saw the world changing but held fast to the status quo. So where do we begin? Maybe it's best to start with what we know. We know that there is racial injustice in our community. We know that there is political corruption in our country. We know that there is climate change in our world. There's a myriad of things that we know for which I don't know will no longer suffice. But what are we going to do about it? As I spoke about a few weeks ago while we looked at the book of Romans, becoming firm on one's conviction, balanced by intellectual humility, can bring our world together. So maybe the place to start is to compile a list of our convictions, things that we really believe. And the good news is that you don't have to do this on your own. One of Northwestern's general spirituality programs is called Northwestern Believes. It's led by our very own Eric Basinski. It's a great place to begin this journey of reflection. What's most important in your life? If you're willing to take some time and to write down what it is you do know, well, our lists of convictions may be different, may be long and varied. It's a great starting point. A starting point for a lifetime of real, meaningful actions based solely on what you actually know, on what you believe. The question placed in front of us by the gospel of Jesus is this: what new thing is God doing in the world right now? And are we going to join the movement? Or are we going to continue in the familiar discomfort of I don't know? May God, in his wisdom, continue to ask you for the truth about what you do know. And may you find companions for the journey of discovery. Companions with the courage to ask hard questions, even in the face of a few I don't knows. And may we form a beloved community led by the Holy Spirit, who regularly lets go of tradition, of anything that doesn't help us move forward, and join in celebrating actions based on our core convictions.